The sound of his boots on the stone floor was a familiar dread, a metronome counting down the seconds of her borrowed peace. Ilara did not look up from the wolf pup cradled in her arms. Its fur was the color of ash, its heartbeat a frantic tremor against her own steady pulse. She had found it near the northern wall, cast out and shivering, its leg bent at an angle that promised a slow death. Now, its whining had ceased, replaced by a low, contented rumble as she stroked the soft space between its ears. The boots stopped. She felt his shadow fall over her, eclipsing the thin light from the stable's high window. 3 years she had been a ghost in this castle, a creature of silent utility. She swept floors, mended tunics, carried water, and never once met a gaze. Her silence was a fortress, and inside its walls she was untouchable. Now, the king stood behind her, and she knew the walls were breached. He did not speak. He was a man made of silence himself, a different kind than hers. Hers was the silence of a locked room. His was the silence of a storm gathering over a vast, empty plain. She could feel the weight of it, the pressure of his attention, a physical force that made the air thick and hard to breathe. The pup stirred, nuzzling its wet nose into the crook of her elbow. Instinctively, a sound left her throat. It was not a word. It was lower, older, a soft, humming note that she had not made, had not even thought, in 1,095 days. It was the sound she had used to quiet the pup's fear, a low, melodic thrumming that was less a song and more a vibration of reassurance. It was the sound his guards had reported, single, soft note hummed in the stillness. King Kalen moved into her line of sight. He did not look at her, not at first. His gaze was fixed on the small gray bundle in her arms. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply made a habit of studying the floor at his feet. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, a map of some hard country she had no desire to visit. A faint, silver scar cut through one dark eyebrow, the only flaw in a face that was otherwise unnervously perfect. His stillness was absolute. Other men fidgeted, their power a restless thing that needed to be displayed. Kalen's power was in his utter lack of movement. He stood like a mountain, and you were the one who had to decide whether to go around or be broken against him. Finally, his eyes, the color of winter frost, lifted to hers. They were not cruel. They were worse. They were analytical, stripping away her layers of invisibility, seeing not the mute servant girl, but the mechanism beneath. 3 years, he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the entire space, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the wooden beams above. Not a word, not a sound. And then, from behind this door, the guards heard singing. He was not asking a question. It was a statement of fact, a fact that had disrupted the order of his world. A broken thing had suddenly made a whole sound. She said nothing. Her throat was a knot of rust and disuse. The muscles required for speech had atrophied, and the will to use them had died long ago. She simply held the pup closer, its small warmth a shield against the cold emanating from the man before her. He took a step closer. The air crackled. She could smell the leather of his tunic, the scent of cold iron from the sword at his hip, and something else, something clean and sharp, like mountain air after a lightning strike. He crouched, his movements fluid and unnervingly silent for a man his size. He was now at her level, his gaze still holding hers. She refused to look away. To look away was to surrender. To look away was to be what they all thought she was. A frightened girl, shattered by a past no one dared name. He extended a hand, not toward her, but toward the pup. His fingers were long and lean, the knuckles scarred. A warrior's hands, a king's hands. The pup, sensing a new presence, let out a tiny, fearful whimper. Without thinking, she began to hum again, that same low, continuous note. The sound filled the space between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of silence. Kalen's eyes flickered, the frost in them momentarily thawing. He watched her mouth, the source of the impossible sound. His hand hovered for a long moment. Before his fingers gently brushed the pup's head, the animal flinched, then stilled, leaning into his touch. He said nothing more. He simply stayed there, crouched in the hay-strewn dirt of the stables, his hand resting on the creature she held, his eyes locked on hers. The world narrowed to this single, unbearable point of contact, his silence and hers, bridged by a dying animal and a sound she had never meant to make again. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he stood. "You will care for it," he commanded, his voice once again devoid of any discernible emotion. "Bring it to the West Wing. The kitchens will provide what you need." He turned and walked away, his boots resuming their steady, implacable rhythm on the stone. Ilara remained on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was no longer a ghost. The king had seen her, and in his eyes, she had seen something that terrified her more than any threat, a flicker of recognition, as if he had been waiting all this time for her to make a sound. She looked down at the pup, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. She had saved it. Or, perhaps, it had just condemned her. The West Wing was Kalen's domain. It was a place of cold stone, ancient tapestries depicting forgotten battles, and a silence that felt heavier, more profound than anywhere else in the castle. Her new duties tethered her to him. She was given a small alcove off the main library, a space meant for a scribe, now repurposed with a pallet for her, and a soft bed of furs for the pup she had named Ash. Days were a quiet routine. She would tend to Ash's leg, binding it with clean linen and a splint fashioned from birchwood. She would mash meat and broth, feeding the pup from her fingertips, and she would watch the king. He worked at a massive oak desk, submerged in maps and letters sealed with the dire wolf crest of his house. He rarely spoke to her. Sometimes hours would pass, where the only sounds were the scratching of his quill, the rustle of parchment, and the soft sighs of the sleeping pup. Yet his awareness of her was a constant pressure at the back of her neck. She would feel his gaze lift from his work, and when she dared to glance up, she would find him watching her, his expression unreadable, his thoughts locked behind that frosty stillness. Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor, did not approve. He was a man whose smiles were as sharp and thin as a razor's edge. He observed her with a predatory curiosity, his eyes lingering on the way. The king's gaze sometimes followed her across the room. Astray. Valerius had remarked to the king one afternoon, his voice pitched to carry. He stood by the fire, warming his manicured hands. They can be tamed for a time, but their nature is fickle. One can never be certain of their loyalties. Kalen did not look up from his map. "The pup is loyal to the one who feeds it." "I was speaking of the girl, Your Majesty." Valerius's smile widened. Kalen's quill stopped moving. The sudden silence of a scratching quill. He set it down with deliberate care, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "Hallie." He lifted his head, and the full force of his cold, unwavering attention fell upon his advisor. "Her name is Ilara." he said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "And she is under my protection. Do you understand me, my lord?" Valerius's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible crack in his polished facade. He bowed his head. "Perfectly, your majesty." The exchange was a declaration. Alara, the mute servant, was no longer just a piece of castle furniture. She was the king's territory. And Valerius was a man who enjoyed testing the boundaries of other men's territory. Proximity began to wear away at her defenses. She learned the rhythm of his days, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was tired, the faint clench in his jaw when a messenger brought bad news from the border. She saw the man beneath the crown, a man burdened by a kingdom that was perpetually on the brink of war, surrounded by men who coveted his power. One evening, a storm broke over the castle, a violent torrent of rain and thunder that rattled the leaded glass windows. Ash, startled by a particularly loud clap of thunder, yelped and scrambled from his bed, hiding beneath her pallet. Kalen looked up, his face starkly illuminated by a flash of lightning. He saw her soothing the trembling animal, her hand stroking its back, her lips moving without sound. He rose from his desk and walked to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. The flames leaped, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. He did not return to his work. He stood by the fire, his back to her, watching the storm. "The night my father was killed," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the sound of the rain. A storm, like this one, was raging. Ilara froze. He had never spoken to her of anything personal. He had never spoken to her of anything at all, beyond direct commands. She watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window, a solitary figure framed by the storm. He was not looking at her, but she knew he was speaking to her. "I was 10 years old. They found me in the kennels, hiding with the hounds. I did not speak for a month." He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the reflection. Silence is a potent armor, but it is a heavy one to wear. He had seen her. Not just her presence, but the fortress she had built around herself. He had seen the weight of the armor she wore, because he had worn it too. In that moment, the vast distance between the king and the servant collapsed into nothing. They were two silent people, standing on opposite sides of a fire, sharing a truth that needed no further words. The storm raged on outside, but inside the library, a different kind of stillness had fallen, one that was not empty, but filled with a fragile, terrifying understanding. That night, she did not sleep in her alcove. She stayed by the fire, ash curled at her feet, and watched the king as he finally succumbed to exhaustion. Slumping into his chair, his head bowed, she watched over him until the storm passed, and the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had already crossed a line she had never even seen. The pup's leg healed. Ash grew, his coat thickening, his paws growing clumsy and large. He became a fixture in the West Wing, a shadow that trotted at Alara's heels or slept at the king's feet. His presence softened the hard edges of their silence. Kalen would sometimes reach down, scratching the wolf's ears without taking his eyes from his work. Alara would roll a small wooden ball across the floor, and the pup's playful antics would sometimes draw a faint, almost imperceptible upturn of the king's lips. These moments were small, fragile things, but they accumulated, building a new reality between them. One afternoon, Valerius entered the library with a retinue of guards. His expression was one of polite, theatrical regret. "Your Majesty," he began, bowing deeply, "a matter of some urgency has arisen regarding the creature." Kalen looked up, his eyes narrowing. Speak plainly, Valerius. It seems the pup is of the northern bloodline. The Dire Pack. The same pack that raided the villages of Stonecross last winter. The markings are unmistakable. Valerius gestured to a guard who stepped forward, holding a captured wolf pelt, its markings identical to Ash's. The law is clear. Any dire wolf found south of the river, it is a matter of security, an oath your father swore. Alara's blood ran cold. She moved instinctively, placing herself between the guards and Ash, who whimpered and pressed against her legs. She looked at Kalen, her eyes pleading. This was Valerius's move. He was using the law, the weight of history, the king's own father's oath, as a weapon. He was not attacking her directly, but the thing she cared for, forcing the king's hand. Kalen's face was a mask of stone. He rose slowly from his chair, his height seeming to diminish the other men in the room. He walked toward her, his gaze never leaving Valerius. He stopped beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He looked down at Ash, then at her. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. This was the choice, law or loyalty, past or present. He could sacrifice the pup to appease his council to uphold an old decree. It would be the politically sensible thing to do. No one would fault him for it. He then looked back at his advisor, and a silence descended that was more terrifying than any shout. The law, Kalen said, his voice dangerously soft, applies to wild animals that pose a threat to my people. He reached down and laid his hand on Ash's head. The wolf, who trusted only two people in the world, leaned into his touch. This is not a wild animal. This is a member of my household, and he is under my protection. Valerius's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. It was a direct challenge, a public refutation of his counsel and the law itself. But, Your Majesty, your father's oath. My father is dead. Kalen cut him off, the words like chips of ice. I am the king, and my word is the law. He held Valerius's gaze for a long, charged moment. Take your men and leave us. The sound of a sharp, collective intake of breath from the guards. Valerius, for the first time since Alara had known him, looked truly off balance. He bowed stiffly, his face pale with fury. As you command! He turned and swept from the room, the guards trailing in his wake. The heavy doors closed behind them, shutting out the world. Alara was trembling. She had not realized she was holding her breath until it came out in a ragged gasp. Kalen was still standing beside her. He did not move away. His hand was still on Ash's head. He looked down at her, and the frost in his eyes was gone, replaced by something dark and intense. Something that felt like a confession. He had not just protected a wolf pup, he had chosen her. In front of his entire court, he had chosen the silent girl and her stray over law, tradition, and the counsel of his most powerful advisor. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. The silence was no longer a barrier. It was a shared space, a territory they now defended together. He slowly removed his hand from Ash, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, she thought he might touch her. His fingers brushed the sleeve of her tunic, a bare whisper of contact that sent a jolt through her entire body. Then he pulled back, his control snapping back into place. He returned to his desk without another word, but the room had been irrevocably altered. A line had not just been drawn, it had been crossed. And they were both standing on the other side of it, in a dangerous new country, with no map to guide them. The aftermath of Kalen's defiance was a quiet tightening of the political screws. Valerius was too cunning to show open dissent. but whispers began to circulate to the court. Whispers about the king's strange attachment to a mute servant. Whispers about a dire wolf being kept as a pet in the royal wing. Alara felt the weight of hostile stares as she moved through the castle. She was a disruption, an anomaly that threatened the established order. Kalen seemed oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the growing tension. He retreated further into his work, but his awareness of her only intensified. The space between them in the library shrank. He would sometimes pace near her alcove while dictating letters, his proximity a tangible force. One night, he was working late, poring over reports from the border scouts. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He had dismissed the guards, and they were alone with the sleeping wolf. She had been mending one of his tunics. The fine black wool, soft beneath her fingers, she noticed a dark stain seeping through the cuff of his shirt. He had been sparring earlier, and the wound he'd sustained had clearly reopened. Without a conscious decision, she stood and walked to him. She carried a small bowl of clean water and a strip of linen. She set them on the edge of his desk, the soft clink of a ceramic bowl on wood. He looked up, startled from his thoughts. His eyes questioned her. She met his gaze and gestured toward his arm. For a moment, he seemed ready to refuse, his pride a palpable thing. But then he looked at her face, at the quiet determination there, and something in him yielded. He slowly, reluctantly, rolled up his sleeve. A long, deep gash ran along his forearm, crudely bandaged and bleeding sluggishly. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and gentle. She cleaned the wound, her touch light. He did not flinch, but she felt the muscles in his arm tense beneath her fingers. His skin was warm. The intimacy of the act was staggering. Her, a servant, tending to the king's body, her hands, which had known only rough labor, now touching the man who ruled kingdoms. She focused on the task, on the clean line of the cut, the dark red of his blood, anything to avoid looking at his face, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move more intense than any physical touch. When she was finished, she began to bind the wound with the fresh linen. His hands suddenly covered hers, stopping her. His touch was firm, his fingers wrapping around her own. It was not a violent gesture, but it was one of absolute possession. Her breath caught in her throat. She slowly lifted her head, forced to meet his gaze. The library was silent, save for the crackling fire and the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears. He was looking at her, as if he had never truly seen her before. The king was gone. The servant was gone. There were only two people in a silent room, their hands clasped over a fresh wound. "Alara," he said, his voice a rough whisper. It was the first time he had said her name when they were alone. The sound of it on his lips was both a comfort and a danger. She did not pull away. She could not. His thumb moved slowly, tracing a line over her knuckles. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it threatened to undo her completely. It was more intimate than a kiss, more revealing than a confession. He was witnessing her, and she was witnessing him. The weariness, the solitude, the man who had forgotten the sound of someone who did not want something from him. In that moment, she understood the warning in his eyes. She'd seen that first day in the stables. He was not just a king. He was a man who had been alone inside his own silence for so long that any touch, any connection was a seismic event. And he had just pulled her into the epicenter with him. He held her hand for a moment longer, then released it as if the touch had burned him. He pulled his sleeve down, hiding the new bandage. "Thank you," he said, the words stiff, formal, a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls she had just slipped past. She simply nodded, gathered her things, and retreated to her alcove. But the feeling of his hand on hers lingered, a phantom heat that promised to burn her if she got any closer. Valerius made his final move, not with a sword, but with a scroll of parchment. He requested an audience with the king and his council, a formal proceeding in the great hall. Alara was not summoned, but she knew. A cold dread had settled in her stomach. She watched from the shadows of a high gallery as Valerius stood before the throne. Kalen was a formidable figure draped in black and silver, his face impassive. But Alara could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Your Majesty?" Valerius began, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "It is with a heavy heart that I bring this information before you. Information concerning the servant girl, Elara." A murmur went through the assembled lords. "For 3 years, she has been a ghost among us, her past a mystery. But secrets have a way of coming to light." He unrolled the scroll. "This is a signed confession from a captured raider, taken last month. He speaks of the raid on Blackwood Manor 3 years ago. The night Lord Alistair and his family were slaughtered for colluding with our enemies across the river." Elara's hands flew to her mouth, a silent scream lodging in her throat. That night, the terrible night no one would name, the raiders were thorough. Valerius continued, his eyes fixed on Kalen. "They left no one alive, or so they thought. One of Lord Alistair's daughters, a young girl, survived by hiding beneath the floorboards. She heard everything, saw everything, and has not spoken a word of it since." He let the silence hang in the air, thick and poisonous. "The girl who serves you now, Your Majesty, is Alara of Blackwood, the sole surviving heir to a house of traitors." The accusation landed like a physical blow. The lords erupted in whispers. A traitor's daughter, living in the king's own wing, with his ear, with his protection. It was a political catastrophe. Valerius had timed it perfectly. He had not accused her of a crime, but of a bloodline. He had made her a symbol of treason, a liability Kalen could not afford. The choice was stark. Kalen could denounce her, cast her out, perhaps even have her executed to prove his strength and sever any ties to a traitorous house. It was the only logical move. To protect her now would be to align himself with her family's perceived treason. It would be political suicide. Ilara watched Kalen's face. It was completely devoid of emotion, a mask of iron. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on Valerius, his eyes 2 chips of ice. She saw the trap closing around him, around them. Her silence, her armor, had become the weapon used against her. It was proof of her guilt, her complicity. If she had nothing to hide, why would she not speak? Her entire life now rested on the decision of the man on the throne. She could remain silent, let him choose, and accept her fate. Or she could do the one thing she had sworn never to do again. She could use her voice. Not to hum, not to sing, but to speak the truth. The thought was terrifying. Her throat felt sealed shut, the words a pile of dust and ash. She looked down at Kalen, at the impossible choice Valerius had laid at his feet. She saw the subtle clench of his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles where he gripped the arm of his throne. He was being forced to sacrifice her for his crown, and she knew, in a moment of blinding clarity, that she would not let that happen. She would not be his weakness. She would not be the weapon that destroyed him. Taking a deep breath that felt like swallowing glass, she stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the gallery. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the hall, at the sea of upturned, hostile faces. She looked at Valerius, his face a mask of triumph, and then she looked at Kalen. His eyes shot up to meet hers, and for the first time she saw a crack in his control. She saw a flicker of something raw, something desperate. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't," his eyes said. "Stay hidden. Stay safe." But she had been hiding for 3 years. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and opened her mouth. The first sound was a choked, rasping cough. The lords below snickered. Valeria smiled. She tried again, forcing the air from her lungs, past the scar tissue of her memory. "He lies." The words were a croak, a tearing, unfamiliar sound, but they were clear. They sliced through the murmuring of the hall, and a stunned silence fell. Every eye was on her. Valerius's smile vanished. Kalen's face was unreadable, but his hands had relaxed their grip on the throne. "My father," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word scraping her throat raw. "My father was not a traitor. He was trying to stop the raid. He sent a message to the capital, a warning that was intercepted." She pointed a trembling finger at the man standing before the throne. By him, the accusation hung in the air, audacious and absolute. Valerius laughed, a short, sharp bark. "The ravings of a traumatized child. She has no proof." "I am the proof," Ilara said, her voice now ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I was there. I heard the raider chief thank Lord Valerius's messenger for the information for the maps of the manor's defenses, for the promise that the king's patrols would be diverted that night." The silence in the hall was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Valerius's face had gone ashen. He had built his trap so carefully, using her silence as its foundation. He never imagined she would simply speak the truth and tear it all down. Kalen had not moved. He watched her, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked like awe. He had been ready to fall on his sword for her, to choose her over his kingdom, but she had not asked him to. She had forged her own weapon and saved them both. He rose from his throne. "Lord Valerius," he said, his voice a low, deadly calm, "you will be escorted to the dungeons. Your role in the massacre at Blackwood Manor and your subsequent treason against the crown will be investigated thoroughly." Guards seized Valerius, who struggled for a moment before his arrogance crumbled into fear. He was dragged from the hall, his protestations dying as the heavy doors slammed shut, the final booming echo of a closing door. Kalen's gaze returned to Ilara in the gallery, the lords, the court. The entire world seemed to fade away. There was only the king on his throne and the girl who had broken her silence to save him. He did not smile. He did not offer words of thanks. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes was the silent, profound acknowledgement of a debt that could never be spoken, and a bond that had just been forged in fire and truth. The world exhaled. The whispers that followed were of a different sort. Now, not of suspicion, but of wonder. The story of the mute girl who spoke truth to power became a quiet legend in the castle halls. Ilara of Blackwood was no longer a ghost. She was a woman of consequence, her voice a thing of newfound power, but she used it sparingly. The words had been a weapon, and she sheathed it as soon as the battle was won. She found she preferred her old quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a choice, not a prison. Kalen granted her the restored lands and title of her house. She stayed in the West Wing in her small alcove off the library. The routine returned, but its meaning had changed. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution and observation. It was a space of deep, abiding trust. They had seen the worst of each other's worlds and had chosen to stand together. One evening, weeks later, they sat by the fire, as they always did. Ash, now nearly full grown, was a warm, heavy weight across both their feet, a living bridge between them. Kalen had been staring into the flames for a long time, a rare look of peace on his features. Alara was reading, the book resting in her lap. He reached over, not touching her, but setting a small carved object on the book. It was a dire wolf, whittled from a piece of dark wood, its details perfect and precise. A king's hands, she thought, were capable of more than holding a sword. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "My father carved one for my mother," he said, his voice low. It was a promise that the wolf would always protect its own. He was not looking at her, but at the fire. It was not a declaration of love. It was something quieter, deeper, a statement of fact, a declaration of allegiance. She ran her thumb over the smooth wood of the carving, the weight of the promise settling in her heart. She did not need to say thank you. He did not need to hear it. He knew. It was the same low melodic sound she had used for Ash in the stables, the sound that had started everything. It was not a performance, it was for him, a quiet offering in the language they now shared. Kalen closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply listened. The fire crackled, the wolf sighed in its sleep. And in the quiet stillness of the room, surrounded by the weight of their shared history, the two silent people finally found their home. It was not a triumphant ending, with declarations and promises for the future. It was a hard-won stillness, a quiet beginning in a world that had finally, after so long, fallen silent around them.